For today, there'll be two different parts to the presentation. The first part, I'll talk a little bit about networks, brain networks for social processing, how they work in the normal brain, and I'll give two examples. One is social cue perception and one is mentalizing. And then I'll discuss how these networks do not work when it comes to schizophrenia. I'll make a distinction that's becoming increasingly important, which is the difference between social ability and social motivation. It's the difference between whether or not someone can process information versus whether they want to engage with other people. So you could view the two parts of this talk. Both of them will be fairly brief. The first one is to say, how does social processing work in healthy individuals in the normal brain? What goes wrong in disease? The disease that we're talking about is schizophrenia. And then the next part of that is, once we know that, is there anything we can learn about what happens in the general population? What about social impairments in the general population, not people who have schizophrenia or another disorder? So the two examples that I'll give for social processing abilities is social cue perception and mentalizing. And social cue perception involves everything you do to identify cues from faces, voices, movements, gestures, gait. It's the area that's most commonly studied both in schizophrenia and in healthy individuals. And in any performance test, these are not hard tests to develop. In any performance test, you'll see that there's big differences between people with schizophrenia and healthy controls and how well they identify faces. And we do this usually automatically. So for example, here's Little Red Riding Hood, and she looks scared. But she is not showing prototypic fear. That's prototypic fear. So we have lots of examples where we have people with reduced level of emotion, but we still tell what it is. We scan faces reflexively. When you walked into this room, you saw too many faces to be able to identify any. But as you got closer, you started identifying faces, you started recognizing faces, and importantly, you received social cues about the emotion in those faces. And that's where you decided to sit. The brain regions associated with this have been well worked out. They include the fusiform gyrus, the amygdala, the superior temporal sulcus, inferior gyrus for certain areas, so that this is a well worked out network for social cue perception. Now, in schizophrenia, there's been a lot of neuroimaging, particularly Fmri work. There's no less than 3 different meta-analyses on the Fmri of face emotion processing in schizophrenia. They all show basically the same things. They show that there are clear between-group differences, and they occur in the same areas that I just showed you. They include, the controls have more activation with emotional faces in the amygdala, in the fusiform gyrus, and in contrast, patients activate regions that are not typically associated with face processing. So if you take social cue perception, it's an area that we know very well from healthy individuals. It's an area in which if you have performance tests, patients show impairment. And it's an area when you have activation tasks in functional MRI, you see clear group differences. And the effect sizes are large. So this is an area in which you see it at behavioral neural levels. Now, another example is mentalizing. Mentalizing is different. It's the way that we make an inference about the mental states of others. So what do other people think? What are their intentions? What are their beliefs? To understand the behavior of others, we need to get into their point of view. Our phrase in English is that we put ourselves in someone else's shoes. Again, there's a lot of performance-based data. The differences between patients and controls is very large. These are large effect sizes. And we can look at activation differences as well. So with mentalizing, you can think about, well, I'm good at identifying emotion in faces. This is a boy eating ice cream. Kids eating ice cream are happy, although this kid's not happy. So you started with social cue perception. Something didn't quite make sense, and now you've moved into mentalizing. In other words, you've gone from saying, I can see emotion in this face, to, I wonder what's going on in this kid's mind. So you needed to use now another network. Now, sometimes faces are intentionally ambiguous, like this photo from one of Bob Dylan's early albums, in which they wanted the viewer to start mentalizing. Sometimes faces are just plain hard to interpret for reasons that we can't quite understand. Sometimes you have to do detective work in order to figure out what someone else is thinking. And sometimes we're at a loss and we're just not sure what to do. Now your mentalizing system has started working, but it doesn't know where to go until you fill in the rest of the picture. At this point, you now know what the woman is thinking. There's a very standard mentalizing network. It includes the temporal parietal junction, temporal pole, precuneus, and medial prefrontal cortex. It is reliably activated in tasks that involve mental state or mentalizing. So the question is, how do you do this in the scanner? Like, how would you measure this in the scanner? There's a number of paradigms, one of which is called the false belief task. In these tasks, I'll give you an example to show how you can do this. In these tasks, this person is in the scanner and they're reading something, and they read that John told Emily that he had a Porsche. Actually, his car is a Ford. Emily doesn't know anything about cars, though, so she believed John. And when Emily sees John's car, she thinks it's a, and then you have to answer the question. It's not hard to answer the question. You know how to answer the question, but to do so, you need to stop what you know to be real and put yourself in Emily's position. And that's the only way to get it correct. Now, here's a false picture condition. Amy made a painting of a treehouse 3 years ago that when it was blue. That was before the storm. We built a new treehouse last summer, but we painted it red instead. The treehouse in the painting is, and again, you can get this right. It's not too hard. Our patients can get it right, but you have to suspend what you know to be true now to make a judgment about what's in the picture. Okay, in both of these things, you have to give up what you know to be true or to be true now to get the right answer. So what's the difference between these two? Okay, from a cognitive point of view, they all have some reading, some working memory, they have some imagery. From a cognitive point of view, these two conditions are very similar. From a social point of view, they're very different. One involves a human mind, and one does not. That's the difference between them. One involves a human mind, and one does not. So any activation differences we see, we can attribute to a human mind, and we see them. We see reliable differences in the regions that I just mentioned to you in our healthy controls. We see them in the patients with schizophrenia, but to a much, much less extent. So again, with mentalizing, just like with social cue identification, we have performance differences, we have neural differences with Fmri, and so that we can understand these patient control differences at multiple levels. Now, I gave you two examples. I gave you the faces for social cue perception. I gave you mentalizing. But if you have enough time, you can do studies in all of these processes, and you can do studies on all of these sub-areas, and people from our laboratory have done all of that. The findings, though, are important in one respect, which is that patients aren't uniformly poor on all of them. In other words, what we see is that patients are impaired in some of these sub-processes, they're intact in others, and they're relatively intact in yet others. That's remarkable. For someone who studies cognitive and social processes in schizophrenia, it's gratifying and reassuring to see that not everything's bad, that there's some areas of impairment, there's some areas that are fully intact, and there are some areas that are mainly intact. So this suggests that the different neural networks associated with these processes are impacted to a different degree in schizophrenia, and they're not all impaired. Let me now transition to another part of social processing, which is social motivation. So everything that I've said so far you can think of as social ability, your ability to do things. Social motivation's different. And there's two types of social motivation. We will keep coming back to this. There's the motivation to approach others. There's a motivation to avoid others. And you might say those are just two sides of the same thing, but they're not. Those are two different neural systems. Those are two different neuropharmacological systems. Now, in schizophrenia, it's not entirely new. We've studied social anhedonia. We study negative symptoms. Many of you here are experts in negative symptoms. We know that social anhedonia is linked to schizophrenia spectrum. We know it's linked to people at risk for schizophrenia. But studying social motivation in the laboratory is a bit complicated. We're pretty good at assessment of negative symptoms with interviews. Studying in the laboratory is a little bit harder. First of all, you want to separate out social from non-social motivation. And secondly, you'd like to do it not at the level of clinical interviews, but to do it at the level of neural processes in the scanner. So how do you do that? We've recently published a study, Dr. Lee from our lab, in which we looked at reward processing using a task called the one-arm bandit. I don't know if what term is used in Italy. It's a gambling machine where you pull the arm and then you see if you've won money or not. This is implicit learning in which some of the machines, you can see here the green one is good, which means that you usually, but not always, get a good outcome. Bad means you usually, but not always, get a bad outcome. And neutral means you get a third good, a third neutral, and a third negative. Subjects are not told that. They learn it implicitly just by doing the test. So they get rewarded in some situations by money. They get money or they don't get money. Or they get social reward in the form of a smiling face. So you can see that there's two types of rewards, the social being the faces, the non-social being the money. So the question is, do patients or controls differ in their brain activation in response to learning from social or non-social stimuli? And the regions here of interest are the ones you might guess associated with reward processing. That would include the ventral striatum and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So those become the areas of interest for these kinds of reward, including social motivation studies. And the results are that if you look at the ventral striatum or the ventral ventromedial prefrontal cortex, healthy controls show a slight increase in neural activation when they receive the social reward. What happens with patients? You can see on the bottom, you have the social reward on the left, non-social on the left, social on the right. With patients, we see the opposite, and this is a significant interaction, suggesting that there's a very different sensitivity to social versus non-social cues in schizophrenia than in healthy individuals. And these studies are just beginning to take off, but you can see they're a little harder to design because then you need to think of clever ways of contrasting social from non-social stimuli. So that's the first part of the talk. I gave you examples of two social processing systems, social cue perception, mentalizing, talked about how they fail in schizophrenia, talked about how we learn from people in that study normal social processing applied to schizophrenia. So now what I'd like to do is apply this to the question of public health. And specifically what I'd like to do is say, how does what we learned in schizophrenia help us understand social connection or disconnection in the community? So the second part is social disconnection in the general community. There's international trends that we'll mention. I'll talk about the difference between that and loneliness. And most of this second part, this is not going to be very long either, but most of the second part will be how we try to study this. Remember, this is not coming to us through clinics. These people do not generally have diagnoses. So if we want to study social disconnection in the community, how do we do it? And how would we assess their social processing ability? And how would we assess their social motivation? So first of all, this is a big problem. This is a big problem. I'll show you data. One example of data that's relevant to you guys, because it's from the European Union, that 7% of Europeans said that they never meet friends or relatives, not even once a year. That's across the European Union. That is a stunning number, and that is an extreme form of social disconnection. Now, it's not alone, though, because 7% say they can't ask a relative, friend, or neighbor for help. So this is a concern. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking not all European countries are alike. They differ a lot in how socially connected they are. So, what do you think? People in Italy are more socially connected compared to other people in Europe? Have about an average amount social connection? Less socially connected? Or we have no idea because you guys don't answer surveys. Any guesses? Okay, it's obviously not 2, otherwise I wouldn't be asking the question. How many of you think number 1? How many of you think number 3? About half and half. 3. Less socially connected. This goes against every image I have of Italy, okay? So, but let's look at the data. This is the percent that say they are unable to ask any relatives or friend or neighbor for help. Where do you think Italy is? That's Italy. There is no geographic tendencies in this chart. The least connected include France, the Czech Republic, Austria. The most connected, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain. I never would have predicted this. So I can hear there's a lot of reaction to these data. Okay, so The point is that it is a relatively high rate. The average is high. The average is high. The differences are interesting for the Europeans to talk about, but the average is high. And it's true in the United States. It's true in Japan. It's true, we know the UK just appointed a minister of loneliness. This is an international trend. Okay? So, the question then becomes, whose problem is it? Because so far, it's not ours. This hasn't become our problem. This is the problem of sociologists, problems of people in public health. If young people are not working, that becomes a problem of economics. But maybe it is our problem. How much of this is due to issues of mental illness? How much maybe this is my problem. Maybe this is something we can understand with social or affective neuroscience. But right now, the focus has been by sociologists and public health officials. The other problem in this area is that there's very little agreement when people talk about this, whether they're talking about objective isolation, which is disconnection, or subjective isolation, which is loneliness. People are not very precise in how they use those terms, and so we need to be more careful about that. The focus for our group has been in social disconnection, which is an objective, long-standing lack of family relationships and minimal participation in social, family, community activities. Now, we know it's common in schizophrenia. In DSM, it's one of the defining features of schizophrenia is the impairment. But the point is it's frequent in the community and it's a public health problem. When I say it's a public health problem, you might say, well, yeah, but it's not like smoking. It's not like obesity. It's not like poverty. And the answer is, it is like all of those things. These are the risk factors. This is for a 14-year follow-up. This is across a fairly large sample. You see this across all kinds of studies. The rates for socially disconnected in terms of mortality ratios, which is here in red, are about the same as what you see for smoking and poverty and higher than what you see for obesity. So this is a public health consideration. It's a fairly serious one. And it's one that has not received the attention that these other risk factors have received. Now, loneliness, as I mentioned, is different. I mention it now just so that you'll see that we try to keep it separate. Loneliness is associated with depression. It tends to have low correlations with objective disconnection, social disconnection. It follows a somewhat different pattern across the lifespan, but sometimes loneliness and disconnection are related. The most obvious, one obvious example is if there's a loss of a spouse or a partner, that increases both loneliness and disconnection. But in general, in large samples, they tend to be not very highly related. I keep hitting this, I'm sorry. So we'll have to measure these two things separate. Now, if we want to study social disconnection in the general community, what's the general community? It means that we're not going to recruit through clinics. We're not going to go through psychiatrists. We're not going through people that are seeking help. That means we're not going through mental health channels. How heavy is social disconnection? You saw the data from the European Union. That was about 7% with people with what you could say is extreme social disconnection. We've looked at the sociological surveys in the United States. It's about the same. About 5 to 10% of Americans say they have no confidants, no one that they can speak openly to. Is it increasing? I can't address the situation in the European Union. I can tell you that in the United States, the size of social networks over the last 2 to 4 decades is in fact decreasing. And the number of single occupancy houses is in fact increasing. So there are some indications that this is a problem that's not getting better, it might be getting worse. Now, we love to blame our computers and social networking for everything, but I don't think that's the problem here. Social networking is used to avoid social contact when people want to, and it's used to increase social contact when people want to. So this would be an example of something, the data go in both directions, and it seems to be a result of what someone's using the social networking for more than a problem in social networking itself. So we're experimentalists. We want to study this question. So how do you recruit a community sample with social disconnection? Remember, they're not seeking help. So how do we find them? So we figured we'd place an ad on the internet. And we placed an ad that says, do you have few friends, little contact with family members, and typically do activities alone? And we got a lot of calls, okay? So these are people who are online, right? You can say there's other people that are not online. We don't know them. But these are people that are online. We bring them in, we interview them, we assess them, and I'll just give you, we're only partway through our study, so I'll give you some preliminary results today. We have two kinds of recruitment. The main one that I just described is through the disconnection ad, and this is low social connection, this is high social connection, and you can see compared to an unselected sample, this group did not answer any, did not come in because they're low on connections. You have some overlap, but you can see that this sample's shifted towards being more connected. This sample's being shifted towards being less connected. So if you put them together, you have 140 people with a big range in how socially connected they are. And what we did for the purposes of analysis and for really the purposes of this talk is to divide them into 4 groups. We have a very low group based on a cutoff, somewhat low, somewhat high, and very high. And the low group, in case you're wondering, are more disconnected than our patients with schizophrenia. So the range is substantial in these 4 groups. So the data that I'll show you for the next 10 minutes is going to be in these 4 groups of individuals. Again, they are selected through 2 different types of ads. We don't care about the type of ad so much. We want to get a big distribution in the level of social connection. So first of all, you can see that they're in their 40s. This is level of connection, somewhat low to very high. They're in their 40s. You can see it might be meaningful that the percent of females increases as you go from very low to very high. Generally reasonably well educated. This is some college education. Marital status, as you might expect, tends to be more single as you're less connected. But even this group here has a fair amount of people who are single. Most of these people work. Most of these people work part-time or full-time. So it's a group that isn't completely removed, but they're socially disconnected. So that's the sort of demographics of these 4 groups. Again, they were defined simply on where they fell on a scale of social connection. So the first question, how long have they been that way? Maybe they just moved. Maybe they're new to the neighborhood. Maybe this is temporary. The answer here is pretty much no. Most people say they've been that way for 20, 24 years or so. And if you only look at the low collection group, that low connection group, the ones that are most disconnected, they've been that way for 20 to 30 years. Remember, this group is in their 40s. This is another way of saying they've been this way for mainly their entire adult life, okay, on average. Some variation, but at least it's not just because they got a new job or because they moved to a new town. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, which is some of these people have autism spectrum. The answer is very, very few. We're not getting people with autism spectrum. We were expecting to. We didn't. But you can see across the groups there's only 1 or 2. Now, in terms of loneliness, we do find an effect of loneliness. The less connected group is somewhat, and the overall effect here is significant, meaning the ANOVA is significant. And you can see there's some between-group differences, but it shows the pattern of the group with poor connection being more lonely than the groups with higher levels of connection. Again, we weren't sure to expect this. The data are mixed on this in the community, but we find some effect here. Now, let's get to the crux, the main part. Let's do this one first. Social networking, do the groups differ in social networking? Yeah, they do. And it's in the difference that shows the social networking is consistent with the in-person social connections. In other words, the more you have in-person connections, the more you use social networking. So it's not an inverse relationship where people are doing online connections instead. All right, this is where now I want to show you the primary data, and we have enough time to do that and allow time for questions. First question is, are there differences in social processing ability? So we have 4 groups that differ fairly dramatically in their level of social connection. Do they differ in social cue perception or face emotion? Do they differ in mentalizing? Do they differ in a more integrative test of empathy called empathic accuracy, in which you monitor the moods of a person you're watching moment by moment? And because I knew I didn't have much time, I'm not going to discuss the measurement of any of these. I'm perfectly happy to do so. It's what I like to talk about, but there isn't enough time, so if there's questions or afterwards, I'm happy to talk about it. The second part then is I've divided this the way I said I would. Ability here and motivation there. Do they want to socially engage with their environment, and do they have a motivation to approach? In other words, a low motivation approach would mean they're indifferent socially. And then do they have a motivation to avoid? A high motivation to avoid means that they have some degree of social discomfort. So for the first part, let me just walk you through the results here. Social cue perception, mentalizing, empathy or empathic accuracy, do the groups differ? And you do not need to be a statistician to understand these results. Social cue perception, nothing. Mentalizing, nothing. Empathic accuracy, nothing. These groups are remarkably similar in their social processing ability. They are wildly different in how socially connected they are. And you might think that perhaps the reason they're not socially connected is because they have trouble understanding other people. They don't read other people's faces. They don't know what other people are thinking. They have trouble monitoring the mood-to-mood, moment-to-moment changes in mood. None of these data support that explanation. So let's go on to another question. What about motivation? So to look at motivation, we combined a number of scales, factor analyzed them, and came up with 2 factors. Remember, these are 2 different neural processing systems. Motivation to approach, if you have low motivation, you have social indifference. You just basically don't care. These have certain key regions associated with it, including the medial orbital frontal cortex, the striatum, and they have certain neuropharmacology associated with it, including dopamine and oxytocin. The motivation to avoid the social discomfort you can think of as a sort of anxiety-related system. It's a threat-sensitive system. It involves the amygdala, the insula, and it has a neuropharmacology involving cortisol and serotonin. The point is these are 2 different systems, and in terms of social interactions, you can create a number of scales, factor analyze them, and then look to see whether or not the groups differ in their level of social indifference. I don't care. I don't need people. I don't mind them too much. I just don't seek them out. Or a motivation to avoid a social discomfort, which would be to say, people make me a little nervous. People make me a little uncomfortable. So which of these might characterize our sample? This is social indifference, and we have a beautiful, highly significant stepwise function. The group here is very indifferent. The group here is not indifferent at all, and it's a very nice stepwise function in which every group, no, not every group differs from everyone, but most of the groups differ from each other, and it's a highly significant relationship. And remember, we do have a difference in loneliness, but if we can control for loneliness, we still have a highly significant finding, which means we have big group differences in these socially disconnected individuals based on how much they care or whether they have a motivation to approach or whether they're indifferent socially. The situation for discomfort is not as clear. Here we do not have a significant difference. We have something sort of approaching a trend, but it's not quite significant. And in this case, you might say, well, there's something going on with this high group, and I would agree with you. But overall, we're not getting our results for discomfort. We're getting it for this indifference. The group seems to be characterized by the more indifferent you are, the more socially disconnected you are. So let me summarize at this point. I'm good for time, so there'll be time for questions. Let me summarize where we are and then circle back to the question of what we might be able to learn from schizophrenia research. First of all, is it feasible to recruit a sample that has a broad range of social connection? Yes, we found 140 subjects that have a large range, and the lower groups are in fact very disconnected. Is the pattern of disconnection stable over time? Yes. Relatively stable, it looks like, throughout most of adulthood. Is the low level of social connection associated with autism spectrum? No. Is it associated with loneliness? Yeah. We weren't sure what we would find, but it is associated with loneliness here. Is social disconnection in this sample associated with processing ability? No, no, no. We cannot find any ability differences in this sample, and those negative findings are pretty darn negative. So we'll continue to collect samples. We will continue to collect Fmri data. We'll continue to collect EEG data, but the behavioral data indicate no. Is it associated with social motivation? The answer is yes. That there's a very clear and highly significant relationship for social indifference, even controlling for loneliness, but nothing for social discomfort. So in wrapping this up, remember we started with normal social processing in healthies, tried to understand schizophrenia. Now we're applying it to the general community. Does anything that we've learned in the general community apply back to schizophrenia? And you could say, yeah, because, I mean, there's a lot of work going on, I'm sure being discussed at this meeting, that there's some encouraging findings with the psychopharmacology for negative symptoms. In our own lab, we have an interest in psychosocial treatments for negative symptoms. We have some very encouraging data from Felice Reddy in our lab, combining motivational interviewing with cognitive behavioral therapy, and the results are already highly significant there, showing that that can benefit particularly motivational negative symptoms. Also, when it comes to schizophrenia research, keep in mind the patterns that we're seeing are really different from what we see in the community. In schizophrenia, we do have relationships between ability and social connection, and therefore, because of that, most of our work has focused on cognitive ability and less on motivation. We've done a lot of work on social cognitive skills training. My colleague Bill Horan has worked in that. Steve Martyr has worked heavily in developing additional interventions for ability with oxytocin. And we know that oxytocin can affect other aspects of social processing, including social salience and motivation. So oxytocin might be useful for this. The point is, now that we've gone full cycle from healthy social processing to schizophrenia to the general population to schizophrenia, we are now refocusing both neuroscientific and intervention efforts on social motivation.